in any conflict. Your fate will depend on your actions. War crimes will be prosecuted. War criminals will be punished. And it will be no defense to say, I was just following orders.
Ey zahid şaraba eyle ihtiram, ey zahid şaraba eyle ihtiram.
First, we will turn to Herbert Dosena, who is going to talk about the economic colonization of Iraq. And Mr. Dosena is from the Philippines. He is a research associate at Focus on the Global South, based in Bangkok, a project of Chulalongkorn's University Social Research Institute, which focuses on international policy research and advocacy with offices in Manila and Mumbai. As part of the International Occupation Watch Center, he stayed in Iraq researching on Iraq's reconstruction and political transition. Herbert Dosena.
First of all, I'd like to thank all the Iraqis who inspired and helped me with my research, and to all the organizers of this tribunal for persevering with this project. My presentation is a condensed version of a longer report, and just please approach me if you're interested in the details. Okay. Since the US invaded Iraq, Iraq has become the most ambitious, most radical, and most violent project to reconstruct and transform an economy in recent history. My presentation this morning will try to show how the US has been trying to dominate Iraq's economy, open up its market for multinational corporations, and take control of its oil. The US has been attempting to impose an extreme form of neoliberalism, or the economic philosophy that says that the market is best left free and that the state should have no role in the economy but to keep that market free. I will show that this is in flagrant violation of international law, and I will also show that this is founded and will continue to be founded on the continuing denial of genuine democracy and independence to the Iraqis. Based on what the US has been doing in Iraq, I will show the steps by which the US has sought to pursue its economic agenda. I will call this the 12 steps of shock and awe therapy, a therapy which not many of you might want to undertake. The first step, of course, is to invade. While the United States has attempted to neoliberalize other countries before, Iraq is special in that here, shock therapy had to be presaged by shock and awe. And without shock and awe, there'd be no shock therapy. Even before the bombs fell, the blueprint for Iraq's economy was already waiting to be implemented. By February 2003, or a month before the invasion, the US had finished drafting what the Wall Street Journal called, and I quote, sweeping plans to remake Iraq's economy in the US's image, end of quote. Awarded the contract to implement this plan is Bearing Point, a private business consultancy group. Its contract with USAID, a meticulously methodical document, complete with timetables and delegation of responsibilities, is essentially the master plan for the US economic design on Iraq. Let's call it Exhibit A. The language of the contract is revealing. At one point it says, and I quote, the new government will seek to open up its trade and investment linkages and to put in place the institutions promoting democracy, free enterprise, and reliance on a market-driven private sector as the engine of economic recovery and growth, end of quote, as though the new government will have no other choice. The plan calls for nothing less than Iraq's comprehensive transformation from a centralized command economy with very strong state intervention into a market economy in which the state plays virtually no other role but to create, maintain, and defend the openness of the market. This is not about reconstruction as we know it. As Donald Rumsfeld himself said, we're not interested in reconstructing Iraq. This is not about reconstructing Iraq. The second step is to take advantage of the chaos. The US strategy for remaking Iraq's economy is to shock while the Iraqis are still in shock. Bearing Point was explicitly ordered to, and I quote, take appropriate advantage of the unique opportunity for rapid progress in this area presented by the current configuration of political circumstances, end of quote. By the time the CPA, the Occupation Authority, was dissolved in June 2004, it had passed an array of laws that were to be the foundations and pillars of Iraq's neoliberal regime. Among the most groundbreaking was this Order 39, which was described as fulfilling, and I quote, the wish list of international investors by The Economist and as a free market manifesto by Reuters. The order allows foreign investors to buy and take over Iraq's state-owned enterprises, to enter and leave Iraq as they please, to have the same rights as any Iraqi in selling to the domestic market, and to repatriate 100% of their profits and other assets anytime. By moving towards the privatization of Iraq's state-owned enterprises, the order effectively allows the transfer of the Iraqi people's assets to foreign and or private owners, whose priority will now be to maximize profits rather than to provide services or products to the Iraqis. By removing restrictions on investments, the order denies the Iraqi state any power to regulate and control investments entering its territory. By giving foreign investors national treatment, it deprives Iraqis the option to support local producers or pursue industrialization in the hope of attaining a degree of self-sufficiency. The clause allowing full and unimpeded repatriation of profits takes away the Iraqi state's prerogative to compel foreign investors to reinvest their profits in the domestic economy. While oil was exempted in this order, the Bearing Point contract specifically states that it will, I quote, implement USAID-approved recommendations to begin supporting the privatization, especially in the oil and supporting industries. There's also many other orders that I won't have time to discuss. But these orders are essentially the same structural adjustment policies imposed by the World Bank or the shock therapy administered to Russia in the 90s. Only this time it goes much further. The New York Times economic columnist noted that by almost any mainstream economist standard, the plan is extreme, in fact stunning. Former World Bank chief economist Joseph Stiglitz observed that Iraq's was an even more radical form of shock therapy than pursued in the former Soviet Union. If all goes well, says The Economist, Iraq will be a capitalist's dream. The extremism of the plan and the US's officials' determination to pursue it is not just ideological. It was driven by what was at stake. With the US expected to depend on other countries for 70% of its oil needs by 2025, we know what it's there for. Old surveys indicate that Iraq holds about 11% of the world total, making it only second to the world's largest reserve, Saudi Arabia. And there could be more, because there's widespread belief in the industry that the wells run deeper and the reserves might actually exceed 300 billion barrels, or about 25% of global reserves. US Vice President Richard Cheney said, and I quote, "While many regions of the world offer great oil opportunities, the Middle East, with 2/3 of the world's oil and the lowest cost, is still where the prize ultimately lies." Dubbed today's California gold rush by a US official, Iraq is giving investors a rush, not just because of oil, but because of the vast market that it could potentially have. As US Commerce Secretary Don Evans saw it, and I quote, "Their collective hopes and aspirations form a valuable market for goods and services of all types," end of quote. The third step is to disregard international law. Because for all that was at stake, all of the laws that the occupation authorities passed are in clear violation of international law. Article 43 of the Hague Regulations states that the US could not overturn existing laws and pass new ones. Only a sovereign government could. Article 55 states that the US could not sell off Iraq's state-owned companies. Only a sovereign government could. But there was a bigger problem. Resistance to the occupation in general and opposition to the laws themselves in particular. According to a survey by the CPA itself, up to 86% of Iraqis as of May 2004 wanted the coalition forces to leave, and only 6% wanted them to stay. So even if the policies violated international law but had the support of the Iraqis, the US would have rested easy. The problem was that the changes that the US was introducing did not have the consent of the Iraqis and were widely unpopular, even among those who supported the invasion. And the problem of the US was that the Iraqis were not just waiting for the courts to decide on the legality, they were throwing bombs at the Americans. So what the US needed was summed up by the chair of the Royal Dutch Shell when asked what the conditions need to be met before oil companies could move in. I quote, "There has to be proper security, legitimate authority, and a legitimate process by which we'll be able to negotiate agreements that would be long-standing for decades." End of quote. The fourth step is to undergo the political transition process. Because given what Sir Watts said, the US solution was straightforward. If only a sovereign government could legally do the things that it wanted to do in Iraq, then the US would have to create this sovereign government itself. Not just any kind of government, but one that is structurally conducive to the US preferred economic policies, run by Iraqis willing to implement and defend those policies, and insulated from popular pressures. Because if the decisions had been entirely up to the occupation authorities, they would have preferred to go slow and to make sure that the conditions for managing the political process were firmly in place before letting go. They didn't want elections, or they didn't want it to proceed as soon as it did. At one point, they even broke up elections that were organized by Iraqis at the grassroots, and they refused one-person, one-vote elections, despite claims by the Ministry of Planning, Census Bureau, and even by some British officials that direct elections were possible even before. But as Paul Bremer said, and I quote, "I'm not opposed to elections, but I want to do it in a way that takes care of our concerns. Elections that are held too early can be too destructive. In a situation like this, if you start holding elections, the people who are rejectionists tend to win." End of quote. Bremer was obviously referring to Iraqis who opposed the presence of US military forces in the country, objected to the political and economic agenda of the US, and refused to be part of US-installed political institutions. A senior official of the CPA was more direct when he said, I quote, "There's not enough time for the moderates to organize." End of quote. But with the growing resistance by that point, the US was forced to relent. As a Pentagon official said, and I quote, "The transfer of sovereignty clearly will have an impact on security because you rid yourself of the occupation label." End of quote. But this was very risky. As former National Security Advisor Brent Scowcroft said when the earlier Bush was faced with a similar dilemma, I quote, "What's going to happen the first time we hold an election in Iraq and it turns out the radicals win? What do? We're surely not going to let them take over." End of quote. So the fifth step is to bring in the experts and embed the advisors. Because while the US authorities were trying to defer the inevitable, occupation authorities quickly moved to preempt a future Iraqi government on some of the most fundamental decisions any government has to make regarding its economy. To plant the laws and policies that the US liked, it placed hundreds of advisors, quote unquote, in key ministries in the bureaucracy. For example, there was a former head of Citicorp to oversee the privatization, a former vice president of Cargill, the very same person who drafted the WTO negotiations that are very controversial till now, a former chief executive officer of Shell, and most interestingly, the US hired the services of Yegov Gaidar, the former Russian prime minister who administered the country's own shock therapy. Practicing what it preached, the US also privatized the project to privatize Iraq by subcontracting various tasks to an army of private contractors contracted by the USAID, such as Research Triangle Institute, Creative Associates to privatize Iraq's educational sector, Abd Associates to reform Iraq's health sector, etc. In the name of technical assistance, the contractor was authorized to change law to begin to reform, revise, extract, or otherwise advise on changes to policies, laws, and regulations that impact the economy, end of quote. They even went so far as to set up offices staffed by Bearing Point employees within the Ministry of Finance and the central bank. Okay, next step, sixth step. The sixth step is to put Iraqis out front. Because the laws, the structures, and the institutions that the US was constructing in Iraq were not going to survive on their own. The US, from the earliest days of the occupation, had searched for Iraqis who would be willing to do what it wanted them to do because their interests converge with that of the US. Thomas Friedman, the influential columnist, called this strategy as putting, I quote, more Americans out back and more Iraqis out front, end of quote. It's worth mentioning that the US policy champions, in the jargon of USAID, are not just to be put inside the formal apparatuses of the state, but also within civil society. The US has been building up a pro-US, pro-neoliberal civil society by creating, funding, and supporting NGOs, trade unions, business councils, research institutions, etc., that are amenable to the US plans. And so while the relationship between these Iraqis while the relationship can be turbulent, the Americans know that they need the Iraqis out front as much as the Iraqis need the Americans out back. Okay, because the story of the political transition is the story of how the US attempted to manage the process and determine the outcome every step of the way. Fast forward to step number 7. The first step of the political process was on June 28th, when the US reportedly handed over sovereignty to Iraq. But what does this sovereignty exactly mean? State Secretary Colin Powell said, I quote, "It's sovereignty, but some of that sovereignty they're going to allow us to exercise on their behalf and with their permission." End of quote. With the US ultimately deciding which part of that sovereignty they're going to exercise on the Iraqis' behalf and which part they were going to concede to the Iraqis, US Congresswoman Pelosi's description of the event was perhaps most accurate, I quote. It was essentially a handover of the authority from the US-led occupation to the new embassy there, end of quote. Why was this so? First, the so-called interim constitution, which was drafted by the American lawyers, was to remain in force. That meant that all the Bremer orders would also remain in effect. Second, all of the troops were going to stay behind indefinitely, and the interim government had no power over them, no authority to order them to leave, no control over their operations, and no power to prosecute them in case they commit crimes because they were granted legal immunity by the US. Third, the US also created new commissions which, according to the Wall Street Journal, I quote, effectively take away virtually all of the powers once held by several ministries, and their chiefs were appointed to 5-year terms, meaning they could not be replaced by the incoming government. All of the 100 to 160 advisors of the US were going to stay. All these indicated that the handover did not end the occupation, but merely inaugurated a new relationship between the Americans and the Iraqis. As one White House official said, I quote, "We'll have more levers than you think, and maybe more than the Iraqis think," end of quote. The next step is, while you create your sovereign government, you're also going to decide whom you're going to transfer the sovereignty to. In the end, it was the US through Bremer and a certain Robert Blackwill who chose Iraq's new Prime Minister Iyad Allawi. Bush's unofficial envoy to Iraq, Blackwill was said to be, I quote, "the single most influential person when it comes to decision-making in Baghdad today." And he gave the UN the names of the Iraqis that the US favored and reportedly railroaded the interim governing council into supporting Allawi. Brahimi came out of the negotiations saying, I quote, "I sometimes say, I'm sure he doesn't mind me saying that Bremer is the dictator of Iraq. He has the money, he has a signature. Nothing happens without his agreement in this country," end of quote. For the second step of the political process, the formation of the Iraqi Interim National Council in August, the US and the IGC agreed to reserve 19 out of the 100 seats to the parties that were already in the IGC, or the Iraqi Governing Council. In the end, no voting eventually took place in that conference, and a 4-member panel ended up handpicking the members. The step number 9, put your friends in power. The third step in the political process was the elections held last January. And here, the US did everything in its power to make sure Scowcroft's scenario of the radicals taking over power does not come true. the US allotted more than $30 million to provide, I quote, strategic advice, training, and polling data, end of quote, to moderate and democratic Iraqi political parties in order to make them compete effectively and to increase their support among the Iraqi people. All these are the words of the US officials. Brought in to carry the electoral operations were the usual democracy promotion organs such as the National Endowment for Democracy, and you know all these outfits. And they are documented to have supported and funded pro-US parties in Venezuela, in Nicaragua, in Haiti, in Ukraine, El Salvador, etc. The CIA was also reported to be planning covert operations to influence the election outcomes. So even as the US gave the allies advantage, it also sought to weaken the rivals. The election law gave the Electoral Commission appointed by Bremer the power to disqualify candidates. And as the US was busy handing out cash to people, the IRI's president, Lorne Craner, put it, if you're a violent party outside the process, this is not the right place for you. You don't have access to US funds. 10th, keep your friends in line. So through the first 3 steps of the stage-managed political process, we've seen that the US has so far succeeded in installing a government that's supportive of the US goals in Iraq. Currently at the helm of Iraq's interim government are virtually the same political forces who came side by side with the Americans during the invasion and who were subsequently appointed to the IGC. And most of them have followed US instructions. For example, Alawi, just before bowing out of power, signed guidelines permitting the multinational oil corporations to develop Iraq's reserves and to keep oil policy out of the hands of any future Iraqi government. The Vice President Adil Abdel Mahdi of Shiri, and now Iraq's Vice President, said the government intends to privatize the Iraqi National Oil Company. And now it's clear what the plans are. Iraq will form a state oil company that will walk and talk like a state oil company that will not be a state oil company. It will be nominally state-owned, but it will be open to foreign investors. It will be politically independent, but it will be run by a professional management team insulated from the political interference in day-to-day affairs, I quote, end of quote. In order to further circumscribe the power of any Iraqi government in the future, the US has also tapped the services of the usual multilateral financial institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank, which are known for disciplining recalcitrant governments resisting economic restructuring. In November last year, the Paris Club decided to forgive a portion of Iraq's $40 billion debt, but only if it follows the IMF conditions, and we know what these conditions are. And now we have, at the head of the World Bank is the former Defense Undersecretary Paul Wolfowitz, who once said, when asked why the US invaded Iraq and not North Korea, said, I quote, "Economically, we just had no choice in Iraq. The country swims in a sea of oil." Okay, final step. Keep the troops ready to march out anytime. Because just in case anything happens, just in case the rejectionists don't follow rules or they win, the US can always call in the troops. Or, in the case of Iraq, order them to march out of their bases anytime. The indefinite presence of the US troops and the planned establishment of 14 permanent military bases in Iraq represents the ultimate safeguard for the US economic agenda in Iraq. They will serve to threaten and restrain any Iraqi government's ambitions. Such will be the enduring relationship between the US and the Iraqi government. One US official summed it up saying that although the Iraqis were, I quote, "the ultimate determinants of their own destiny, we have 140,000 troops here and they're getting shot at. We're also spending a lot of money. We don't dictate action plans, but we constantly remind them that we're working toward the same goal and we have our red lines." The US will ensure that in case the laws and institutions that they're creating in Iraq falter or the Iraqis cross the red lines, Iraq's neoliberal regime will endure as it was created, by force. So, let me sum up by saying that among the goals of the United States for invading Iraq is to open up its market and to control its oil. Therefore, we should not expect the US to leave Iraq without attaining these objectives, no matter what it takes, even if it takes 100,000 lives. The pursuit of these goals rests on violations of international law. and the unending deprivation of any real meaningful democracy for Iraqis. I ask the jury not only to confirm the illegality of these actions in pursuit of this capitalist's dream, but also to affirm the legality of the Iraqis' right to resist them and to dream another dream. Thank you.
Ey zahid şaraba, eyle ihtiram. Ey zahid şaraba, eyle ihtiram. İnsan ol cihanda, bu dünya fani. Ehline helaldir, ha ehle haram. Biz içeriz, bize yoktur vebali. Ehline helaldir, ha ehle haram. Biz içeriz, bize yoktur vebali. Sevap almak için içeriz şarap. Sevap almak için içeriz şarap. İçmezsek oluruz düçarı azap. Senin aklın ermez, bu başka